So we arrive at the White House and we are meeting in a room, and the president walks in, shakes everybody's hand, and he makes some very brief comments about this being a listening session, about wanting to hear our perspective, and then kind of really hands over the mic to me and asks me to go first. And I let the president know that I'm, a Palestinian American, and that the community is in a lot of pain, but also that they're not represented here at this table. There were medical professionals who had been on the ground. There were Muslim American leaders, but I was the only Palestinian American, and that they felt excluded and they had felt silenced. And I wanted to communicate the message about Rafah. Kind of, it needs to be a red line, and that the suffering that's there is very intense, despite any sort of counter narratives they may be hearing that suggests otherwise, and that I needed to leave out of respect for my community. I needed to leave out of respect for the pain and the suffering that's going on in Gaza, especially considering that everything leading up to that meeting has suggested that there would be no changes with respect to policy in the Middle East, that there would be no additional measures taken to try to end the war and stop it as quickly as possible, that there would be no consequences to a Rafah invasion. And so I got up to excuse myself and I said, before I leave, I want to hand you this letter from this 8-year-old girl. Her name is Hadeel, and she lives in a tent in Rafah right now. She's an orphan, and she's from Khan Yunis, and she had lost her home and lost her family. And the contents of the letter was her essentially begging the president to make sure that a Rafah invasion does not happen, and that she was scared of that. And so I handed him a picture of her as well, and he took a look at the picture, and he said he understood. And so, I walked away after that. I mean, but I'm sure President Biden is going to be very critical of Prime Minister Netanyahu on that phone call. But if that phone call does not have consequences, if there isn't a red line that's drawn, then I don't expect the facts on the ground to change. And we're actually being, quite clear about what are the things that need to happen. First and foremost, there needs to be no invasion of Rafah. And if there is an invasion of Rafah, that needs to have a series of consequences. It can be delaying transfers, it can be suspending military aid, it can be as far as another action to the United Nations Security Council without undermining it by calling it non-binding. I mean, there are several concrete steps that can be taken that can send a message loud and clear. But if your rhetoric, on one hand, is saying the human suffering needs to stop, there is a humanitarian catastrophe, but then we're hearing through the Washington Post or through other media outlets that there's a new approval for fighter jets, a new approval for these massive bombs and ammunition, then that is something is not going to fool anybody, especially a community that's paying as close attention to the conflict as the Palestinian, Arab American, Muslim American community. They're very well informed about what's taking place. And the consensus is that there needs to be a ceasefire. The consensus is that we want a ceasefire immediately. And it's also about the releasing of the hostages, really kind of de-escalating the hostilities in a way that people in Gaza can exist without the fear of violence. We want the border to be open as well, the land crossings, because President Biden announced in the State of the Union address a maritime corridor, and we have been doing airdrops. But all of that is just supplementary. It's not going to replace land crossings being open. So we're asking for those to be open, and we're asking that the United States make sure that there is no restriction of aid. Talking about food, water, and medicine here. I understand that there might be hesitation, but it's not because they don't have the power. I understand that the Biden administration is hesitating to necessarily, put the hammer down and draw that red line, but it has the capacity to do so. It has the power.